social relevance. And part of it is very important question, I think, for all of us. At least I think it's a very important question. How exactly we are relevant outside of the Arctic? You know, in some ways we were sort of compartmentalized within our Arctic uniqueness, so to speak. And I think it is important for us to reflect on where Arctic social sciences are within the various disciplines and within the family of social sciences. So the next set of questions deal with that. So in which ways we're contributing to social sciences outside our region, and which contributions we think are important and we continue to be emphasizing and making, and of course, what is the role of the knowledge that we produce in addressing global needs, or needs and opportunities in other regions. So basically, kind of take off a little bit our hats as Arctic specialists and try to think broader. So I think it's very important to do that.
To other fields of social science or science in general, but at least toward the end we were able to also talk about broader impacts more generally. So the first, or the part A of the question, you know, has there been a global impact of the results or the methodologies of Arctic social sciences? We've been able to find a couple of examples. I think, you know, our overall assessment is it's not that Arctic social science has revolutionized social sciences in general on a global scale, but there are specific sets. And I think, you know, one and probably a very general thing is that we were at the forefront of interdisciplinarity. So something that is now in everyone's mouth in many parts of the world. Interdisciplinarity within the social sciences and beyond. You know, the Arctic program within NSF was actually one of the first stages, the first places where this was practiced, and the Arctic social science in particular. There, you know, another example that was brought up was disaster research in sociology. A lot of it comes from you know, the tragedy surrounding the Exxon Valdez, and you know that the lessons learned there, and you know some people are here in the room who kind of studied that, you know, have influenced what is being done elsewhere in the world till today. Indigenous knowledge has been mentioned several times today. Indigenous knowledge is not only is also used by social scientists, but not only, of course. But I think that the incorporation of social science, of indigenous knowledge, is in that part. The Arctic is also a leader, or among the leaders in the world. The same would be true for community participation as a research methodology, and community resilience. Not that we have found the solution to community resilience, but we have in the Arctic, in the North, accumulated a lot of data on these issues. And probably one of the most obvious things needs to be said, mentioned at least, the community impacts of climate change. Now, there has been so much work, and I think there are certain lessons we have learned, and probably more recently food security as an issue that comes very strongly from the Arctic, but is relevant elsewhere as well. B, we really interpreted more, you know, you can interpret the question in a variety of ways. We looked at it primarily in the sense of what is not so ideal, or what is not being, what is not so good. You know, I think we need to ask the self-critical question, you know, are we still able to address global issues, global questions? Are the questions that we are asking in the Arctic questions that are relevant for the rest of the world? And I think the answer was not clear. I think, you know, I think we need to do more. And I think we need to do more comparison with non-Arctic places. in order to make sure that this relevance for the rest of the world is there. And so we need to ask ourselves, for which questions is the Arctic the best place to ask a particular question? And not just, why do we, to do research in the Arctic because it's easy or cool or hip to do so. Parts of the problems with the transferability of Arctic research is, of course, the low population density. So the very specific conditions of the Arctic also sometimes inhibit the transfer of certain principles. So we need to ask the right questions that are global questions, and where really the Arctic is the ideal place to ask them. Third question, if Arctic conditions act as a global driver, can the Arctic social sciences play a critical role outside the Arctic? Maybe. And it's a real challenge again, how to upscale the Arctic experience. Some venues that were mentioned, possibilities such as, for example, storytelling. So how can we tell and frame Arctic stories so that they are heard and noticed by people living elsewhere? And so we digressed in a little discussion, what does the rest of the world actually know about the Arctic? Maybe the Arctic people in other parts of the world never want to know the Arctic. They are just interested in their own fantasies about the Arctic. But we finally found one group of people, namely other indigenous people in the world, who are very interested in the experiences of Arctic indigenous people. So the story and experience sharing across different Arctic communities seems to be a really important issue. And there's a number of projects that have been realized in that respect. I think in general, broader impact, as it is written these days into NSF proposals. One of the questions that we left a little bit unanswered is, what are the big success stories of that? Every proposal has a broader impact section. But what, at the end of the day, is there something? And I posed that as a group, as a question to the whole room here. What are these success stories, if there are any? Maybe one of them might be that the process of doing research in the Arctic has changed significantly in the last 20 or so years. I will leave it at that, or ask the rest of the group what I have left out or misrepresented.
Well, I think table number 5 is ready.
Yes, Andre, we're ready. Some beer and bourbon would be nice right about now, but we're ready. Soon, very soon, okay. One of the first topics we touched upon was the fact that Arctic work has been translating well for other populations, especially indigenous and remote populations around the world, and that we see that this transference from publications, people are looking to get a sense of this, and one mention was traditional culture and alternative economics as a part of that. Community-based research has been pioneered in the Arctic, and so when people are looking at methodological issues, they're frequently looking at research that's been done in the Arctic, so that's a nice transference. We were very honest in stating that Arctic Social Science Program at NSF has a pretty sizable budget for the population in the region of the world compared to the rest of the social and behavioral SPE, I always forget one of the letters in there, economic, thank you, division. And so that's had more of an impact than it might have otherwise, and it's also provided for significant input for indigenous voices within an NSF as well. Social science in some regard is starting to break down barriers between disciplines, and this is coming from Arctic research in particular, especially the nature-culture divide. We're seeing a lot more work that's at that human-environment interface, but we all still admitted that natural scientists still find it difficult to appreciate the social sciences, even if they're forced increasingly by NSF to collaborate with us, and that the natural scientists frequently have a very difficult time finding those collaborative points with indigenous populations. Arctic communities frequently are dependent on single resource extraction economies, and so this kind of work has also been influential on communities in other parts of the world, particularly in economic development research. Comparative research, as the first group mentioned, is needed more between Arctic and other regions. We identified climate change impacts on the Arctic and small island nations as one example. Demographic research, comparisons, and remote economic systems. Then Andre asked the provocative question, what do other researchers think about Arctic social science research? And we said, my response is they don't think about it at all. And if they do, their general responses were that it's too narrow, it's a sideline, and non-representative. And then I did a quick search of the annals of the Association of American Geographers and found that there were a couple of articles in 1983, and then there were 2 more in 2010, and that was about all I could find on the Arctic in Geography's main journal in the US. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Dwayne Gill from Oklahoma State University. And I stole a line from Liesl Ritchie that the Arctic is considered the canary in the coal mine. There's lots of change, but there's also a potential for a model for response to this change that could be applied elsewhere. One of the examples I gave was as communities are forced to relocate, they experience lots of governmental issues, lots of kind of infrastructural issues. How do you move an infrastructure, or where do you relocate? Lots of issues that I think would serve a model for coastal communities outside of the Arctic as we see how the Arctic communities respond to this. Another example that came from Table 6 was the Exxon Valdez work and how that has influenced some of the research that was done at the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of the concepts and theories that came out of the Exxon Valdez work were very applicable to some of the communities on the Gulf Coast that were experiencing the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And I would tip my hat to Arctic Social Sciences. They helped funded some of that work that we did in the Gulf of Mexico. Another point is Arctic research tends to be very or multidisciplinary, and again, this is something that can be exported. I think research in the Arctic has kind of led that interdisciplinary approach, and perhaps part of that was due to the urgency that the Arctic has experienced in terms of kinds of change and a lot of the drivers that we talked about earlier in other sessions. Parallel with some of the others, indigenous people have had more of a voice than perhaps elsewhere, indigenous people in the Arctic, and many are very globally connected, very aware. Governance councils have been able to respond to some of these changes at some level. Co-management as a model is something which has been developed and comes out of some of the Arctic social science work. There's a methodological observation that causation need not be understood in order to generate data, but it is important for developing policy and response. And some of the examples were at St. George in Pribilof Islands, and then there's some application to fisheries management issues as well, co-management. Some of those things came out of the Arctic and again have application in other parts of the world. Did I miss anything?
Just as a kind of a clarification of that last point. So for instance, Shishmaref, this community that's falling into the ocean, I don't think it's really important to understand why it's falling into the community, into the ocean, to make the realization that they're going to have to move. Whereas in St. George, they're not being swept into the ocean, but their economy is failing, and the school is probably going to be closed. And so there are lots of socio and political reasons why St. George is failing that could probably be, if we could understand those, maybe turn those around and not require that the community move. So.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Laura Zanotti from Purdue University. I'm representing Group 3, Session 3 today and this afternoon. So as you might imagine, a lot of things that have been discussed already were topics that came up in our group, but I'll try to capture the way in which we talked about them just briefly here. So the first thing that came up was that an observation that was made earlier that the Arctic is a dynamic space, and that's meant that the questions that we've been asking as researchers have changed over time. And so this example was brought up in particular in relation to archaeology. And so or teams of archaeologists now have changed in terms of including geologists and geomorphologists as they continue to ask questions about climate change, as well as incorporate resilience and adaptation and vulnerability into frames of research. So this was also connected to a second observation about interdisciplinary teams of researchers, transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, that others have already noted, as well as finely tuned ways of trying to understand both quick and slow changes, so both extreme events as well as long-term events. Another comment was that Arctic social science research, and this again has been highlighted over and over today, community-based participatory and action research is not fringe within the Arctic social sciences. And this has meant a couple things. One is that we've been at the forefront and a stronghold of both ethics as well as protocols associated with that type of work, as well as engaging with discussions on Indigenous rights, as well as working with Native corporations, as well as tribal nations and Indigenous peoples in the Arctic. And here boundaries became important to the discussion, as well as there was a comment made about environmental and social impact assessments and ways in which social science researchers have been contributing to that, both in the Arctic as well as worldwide. Another comment was about the pace and extent of change and our ability to examine not only governance issues, but issues on surprise and variability, and what this means in the context for how people respond. We also noted powerful synergies with other regions and spaces who might be experiencing the same thing, such as small island nation states. So here we gave the example of the Maldives and Tuvalu, as well as the coined term of climate migration that came out of Robin Bronin's work, as well as research that Arctic social scientists have done are discussed in spaces such as the United Nations, the Indigenous Peoples Working Forum, and different reports. And finally, in this section, that the Arctic, as others have noted, is unique. And so thinking about displacement around the world, mobility and migration, the Arctic has been a space in which social science research has engaged strongly with questions of land rights and territorial sovereignty, as well as shifts and dislocations. So contributions that we commented on include extreme weather events, hazard research, early warning systems, and dealing with risk and uncertainty in different ways. We thought that the strong community-based research tradition within Arctic social sciences could be extended to other disciplines and fields where this is still a fringe or not welcoming. We also highlighted that Arctic social science work has been pivotal in understanding different ways of being, so different views of place and space, but also asking different questions that's not based on the visual or a rational actor model. So noting things such as smell and noise and other ways of being in the world that asks us to think about questions and different types of research questions that we possibly couldn't have imagined without working alongside communities and doing this type of work. We noted theoretical influences such as complex adaptive systems and complex socio-ecological systems, and that work has also extended out beyond the Arctic. That language, both recognition and importance of language, as well as language publications across different communities would be important, so that was highlighted earlier today as well. And also, we're able to potentially nuance the ways in which we engage more broadly with our work. So noting both the nuance of what we can contribute, but also communicate our results more broadly. And finally, to do more comparative, as some of the groups earlier said, as well as longitudinal work. And then finally, just a couple things. I know it's a long thought, so thanks for bearing with me. We noted our global influence could potentially be addressing uncertainty and complexity. So, for example, going back to hazards work, that could be applied around the world, that we should just, in the words of one of our Team 3 members, keep on keeping on, do better and more effectively. And then finally, how we can think about better ways of transferability. So also that was mentioned on how dealing with change in the Arctic can be applied in other places. And so here, recognizing that the Arctic is an exceptional and unique space, but more and more the experiences that are happening in the Arctic can be relatable to other communities, for example, coastal Florida, that can be applied elsewhere. So thanks everyone for bearing with me at the end of a long day.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Catherine Catlin from Northwestern University representing Table 2. Once again, Table 2 was predominantly archaeologists, so a lot of what we discussed will come from that perspective once again for this table. So the first thing, I'll sort of, as we talked about this, we sort of put together questions A and B on the contributions that Arctic social sciences have and should continue to make to social sciences more broadly. We started by acknowledging that cultural anthropology and archaeology can and have spoken to each other, not just in the Arctic, but as we study all of these processes globally. We talked about community collaboration, interdisciplinarity, many of these other topics that have been brought up by other groups. In terms of the theoretical contribution that Arctic social sciences can and has made, one of the first things that we mentioned was that it offers the opportunity to study the effects of rapid social change at the scale of less than a century to, just several years, especially the changes that occurred in the Arctic after World War II with access to snowmobiles, changes in the way people do agriculture, the way people manage their food resources, how they live in various different kinds of infrastructure. Along with that, the Arctic offers the opportunity to study and to theorize ideas of remoteness and how people respond to extreme climatic conditions, whatever those conditions might be, whether it's extreme cold or extreme altitude or extreme heat. We discussed that that's a contribution that Arctic social sciences can make. In addition, we talked about the migration and mobility as a lifestyle, how many indigenous populations across the Arctic have been living in these very mobile ways for many, many years. So those are two anthropological or sort of social science concepts that can be addressed. And in addition, by putting several of these ideas together, how modern infrastructure can impede the lifestyles that have historically depended on migration and mobility. One of the major things we brought, I talked about rapid social change, but that ties also into the response to a very, very rapidly changing environmental and climate context. So we have that way in which Arctic social sciences contributes broadly to other forms of social sciences worldwide. In terms of archaeology and scientific methods, we talked about ice cores and sea cores happening in the Arctic as something that can contribute to the study of climate worldwide and other kinds of environmental issues globally. For archaeology, we brought up the idea that there's much better archaeological preservation in Arctic and subarctic conditions, at least for now there is. So in some cases, we can say more about what the archaeological record is telling us than maybe some other places around the world that can help us to theorize ecosystem change, technological innovation, and sites as ecosystem archives are somewhat more able to be read and understood in Arctic context than in the rest of the world. So we can use that as archaeologists to think about how these similar processes played out in places where potentially we don't have such a fantastic archaeological record. Okay, so that's the first two questions. How we can play a role outside of the Arctic. We came back to this question of rapid change in the Arctic, and as many other groups have already discussed, tied that to how potentially after we see all of these rapid changes happening in the Arctic, we'll begin to see a cascading effect of more and more dramatic rapid changes happening in the rest of the world. So in terms of disaster relief, how can we handle populations as some of these communities are literally falling into the ocean? What happens when we see this start happening elsewhere? So as Arctic social sciences work with some of these populations who are becoming displaced due to climate, how can we use that knowledge to bring these ideas to the rest of the world? Like we've had some people bring up Katrina. We've had some people also mention what will happen in Florida and other coastal places when sea levels start to rise. And when this happens, how about financial equity? Who is responsible? How do we pay for these kinds of future societal adaptations that will be required for climate change and rising seas? Because obviously we're having difficulty finding the money to pay for this in the Arctic. So given what we're observing there as social sciences, how do we bring this knowledge to other parts of the world when it may be harder or easier or differently situated in terms of paying for relocation when the climate begins to be a major issue? In terms of archaeology, looking at these same issues, we talked about the role of studying past infrastructure and past environment, and how those two things may have worked together in the past, how people were building and constructing infrastructures that made sense given the environment that they lived in. And potentially as we begin to see the need to create new infrastructures as existing infrastructure disappears or falls apart, we can use this knowledge that we've gained through our study of the past to lead towards new infrastructures that are both place-specific and sustainable. And this will also require us to bring in engineers and architects and other sorts of people who we can continue to collaborate with to build a more sustainable world based on the past. So this shows then that we can't have a one-size-fits-all solution, that we need to have a locally appropriate infrastructure. And one way in which studying the Arctic that we discussed can really bring this out is that in some places, particularly in Alaska, some of the laws and codes in terms of who can build and where and what tend to be less restrictive than in other places around the world. So we can study maybe some of these currently existing economic systems to build more flexible economic systems around the world towards sustainability for the future. We talked about scale a little bit, about the Arctic as a microcosm for social and environmental processes, and just brought up the idea of the difficulty of connecting, if we think in terms of a microcosm, the difficulty of going out to a macrocosm or a larger system and all the complex ideas that requires bringing in. Two more points to make. We talked about new energy sources, how many Arctic communities are going quote unquote green, not out of a desire to save the planet, but out of economic necessity. So how looking at these kinds of practices, such as windmills and other ways that people are adapting to their inability to heat their houses to provide electricity for themselves, and how off-the-grid living and other flexible economic systems from these kinds of situations in the Arctic might be adapted to other places where people are undergoing similar economic hardships or similar environmental changes. This also ties into food, the ways that traditional food is eaten in the context of a changing environment, as well as the context of globalization and colonialism, which is going to become a bigger issue through the rest of the world again. Finally, the last point I wanted to make is that the Arctic can serve and has served as a place for international cooperation. And assuming this model continues to be somewhat successful, that may be useful to build international cooperation in other contexts. And one person brought up the Middle East as some place that could potentially learn from international cooperation in the Arctic. All right, that's all.
You know, in these predictive games, sometimes you're rewarded for being as close to the average or the mean as possible. We're in the catbird seat here. Most of what we talked about has already been discussed, so I'm just going to kind of summarize. First point, table 6. Second point, table 6. Third point, I think it was 3. No. Yeah, we agreed in terms of the contributions of Arctic social science. We agreed that one of our contributions was local communities as drivers of research, and we think that's something that we ought to extend in the future. We agreed that with everybody that the Arctic is a place of significant interdisciplinary models, and the recognition that interdisciplinary approach to study may just reflect the complexity of the problems. That in Arctic social science, we've created spaces for indigenous scholarship that I think is something that we would also like to see recreated. I was holding out hope that the comparative stuff, no one would talk about that, but these guys got it. But one place that the Arctic social science research has been used in a comparative way is looking at other places that have similar economic and geographic characteristics, places that are remote. And so we have done some initial comparative research that is pretty productive. In terms of the second question, what stuff we could see building on what's already been done, that's the way we've interpreted it, what stuff we could see expanding in the future. One thing that we suggested was take this research and turn it into educational outreach. You know, let's talk about the educational systems in Arctic rural communities and Arctic communities in general, and let's see how the research that we've done can add to what kids get to learn and how they get to learn it. Another place that we thought Arctic social science could contribute would be in the development of models of leadership. You know, one of the things we talked about this morning was one of the big changes was the increased local control in terms of economic activities, in terms of community-led research. And one of the things that we could help communities do, we could do ourselves, is dig in, do some research on indigenous models of leadership from the past that's worked, look at some of how leadership, what kinds of leadership roles work in the native corporations or the village councils or whatever. And so I think give some help in terms of developing models of leadership. And then last, you know, social change has positive and negative effects. One of the things social scientists do is look at these changes. Two, that at least from a Western perspective, I think in all perspectives, may almost ask for kind of emergency research. And one is the suicide epidemic that seems to be spreading throughout the North, not just the American North, but throughout the North. You know, what can we say about that? How can we help in that kind of thing? And the other is the changing, has to do with the change in gender roles. but what appears, at least to people who look at education and stuff, as sort of a falling behind of the men in rural communities. I think rural communities everywhere, but since we only look at the Arctic, maybe it's just the Arctic. So those are three issues that I think we could expand into: educational outreach, leadership, and some of these more these more dramatic changes that need some research. And then in terms of how we've helped the broader social science, I think kind of mirrors what everybody's said. I think in the Arctic social science, we've shown the social science world that interdisciplinary research can work, and develop some models of how it could work. And then we've also, we're looking at a world where change has been dramatic, large, and long time scale. And so we've developed, we've looked at lots of social change, lots of change, and lessons from looking at that change. Those long time changes that have happened in the Arctic can be useful around the world whenever social change exists. I think that's it.
It's very interesting, right? I mean, I will quote you, and I wrote the direct quote that what we taught other sciences. So I actually want to maybe repeat my question that Jay announced. I'm kind of still curious. I'm not sure I'm satisfied with the answer. In the sense, what do our colleagues, and maybe yourselves, as from looking outside, what do you think when they say, "Oh, I'm Arctic social scientist"? I say it sometimes. What do you do? I just always feel like, what? Right? I mean, what? I kind of wondering how it changed and whether we are in a place where we want to be in terms of recognition, or people just ignore us, or people just say, "Oh, it's so great, wonderful," like little children, So maybe Peter?
Yeah, so I generally think that, we all went through the information at hand, and we tend to be self-congratulatory. That's our normal tendency, and I think there's a lot of things to be proud of over the last 20 or so years. But I think we need to be also really critical of what has not been achieved, and just thinking about the academic side of things for now. I think what was mentioned before, for example, that why haven't there been more publications in the highest-ranking geography journal in the United States? So I think there is a lot of room. I look actually to Shauna, who published in the American Anthropologist just this year as his lead author. So there are positive examples. But I think as a whole, we cannot say that we have been, it's not that every anthropologist, every geographer cites Arctic research if they talk about general issues. And I think that's where we need to pose the question: where are we lacking? Is it just an issue of publication strategies? Are we not aggressive enough going to the top journals? Or is it the nature of the problems, of the issues so that's what is not clear to me, and where I think we need to ask more serious questions of ourselves. But to get specifically to the question that you reiterated, I think, at least among my colleagues, I see, for example, in Vienna, I see just a higher recognition that Arctic research exists, which probably didn't exist before. So people, oh yeah, I've heard that, that there have been books, there has been, maybe it's also from the media or so, but it's not necessarily reflected fully in the academic publication record.
Any other thoughts? We also had a lengthy discussion on publication strategies, but.
Hello, I'm Dixie West from the University of Kansas, and what do people think of social scientists? Well, perhaps I work in a unique area. I work in the Aleutian Islands, and what do other scientists think of us? So, for example, we collaborate with the Alaska National Maritime Refuge. These are a group of biologists who are studying climate change, what's happening to the sea lions, what's happening to the sea otters, what's happening to the birds. They're very, very interested in what those populations were like in the past. And they understand that they're going to be able to get that information from us when we do our analyses. We can radiocarbon date, we can identify those different types of critters, and plus we can radiocarbon date those. So the biologists in the area where I work are very interested in what we do. Also with the Alaska Volcano Observatory, they know what volcanoes are exploding now. They know what volcanoes exploded 20 years ago. They want to know what exploded 200 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And so there are some cases where social scientists and natural scientists, biological scientists, do work together very closely, and we all help each other out, and we go back and forth providing each other with information. Perhaps it's a unique case, but it's a very special way of doing research where we all work together.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Liesl Ritchie, University of Colorado Natural Hazards Center. So a lot of the work that I'm doing as a sociologist with engineers in the space of resilience and the built infrastructure involves me trying to help them understand the social dimensions of resilience in the context of that environment. And it dawned on me as engineers are asking me questions such as, what do social scientists think about X? I think it's fine for us and has served us well to be referred generally to as social scientists, but I think there's also some need to point out to others that we don't all, as social scientists, have a groupthink going on. It seems obvious to us in this room, but geographers and sociologists and anthropologists, we all have different perspectives that we bring to the table. And again, I think it served us very well, but maybe we need to step back a little bit and push back a little bit on others who think that social science is social science.
Thank you very much. Okay, any other thoughts? I just kind of think it's important in a sense because we are framed into the social sciences title by the program itself, and I guess I know it's good things and not so good things about it.